Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG Dr. Neil Holmes and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Today, we have a special guest. We have Dr. Gus Mbuie, who is a renowned microbiologist. He knows more than the average person about this, COVID, the vaccine and everything. So we just want to bring him on and see if we can kill some of these myths that are going on. Dr. Mbuie, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine, Dave.
Hey, why don't we start with what is COVID? I mean, because the average person, they may have an idea of what they think it is, but you being a microbiologist, you probably can provide us with a greater insight. So why don't we start with that?
Okay, good question. COVID is a virus. Like any other virus, it's basically a package of information in the genetic material that should enter inside the cell of the body. And when the material is inside the cell, the material dictates what the cell should do to produce more virus particles. That's basically what it is. It's like a virus attacking your computer. It's just a code that comes in and tells your processor to do certain things, to mess up and do whatever. So that's how all viruses behave. They're not alive. Technically speaking, viruses are not microbes. They're not alive organisms. They're just piece of information. But they're made up, their structures is made up of nucleic acid inside, which is the code, the blueprint for making more particles like that. And that blueprint codes for the production of a structure that will protect that code. That's what we call the code, the core of the virus, and then it makes the capsid, the shell. So this shell has to have certain structures on it that will latch it onto cells so that this core of nucleic acid can go inside the cell. So COVID is coronavirus. Coronavirus, like many other viruses, are detected and described by the shape and the way they look under the electron microscope. So coronavirus, if you look at it under the electron microscope, it looks like a daisy. So the flowers around the daisy, if virologists imagine it to say, oh, that virus looks like it's wearing a crown. So corona comes from a crown. It's a crown-looking virus. It attacks. There are many different species. There are coronaviruses that attack cows, they attack chicken, they attack many birds, and they attack pigs and attack human. And for all the past years before COVID took on this amplitude, coronaviruses were just lumped together with all the other viruses that cause colds. Common cold is caused by a variety of viruses. Among them was coronavirus. It wasn't deadly in human, it wasn't deadly in other species, but coronaviruses were very deadly in chicken and birds. So the veterinarians knew about it. They made the vaccine against the coronavirus for chicken, and then they made a coronavirus vaccine for cows. But they weren't that good, and the disease was not that rampant, so they abandoned it. So they never made any more coronavirus vaccine. So now until 2005 or so, when there was this disease in Hong Kong called SARS, S-A-R-S, Southern Respiratory Syndrome. Well, that sudden respiratory acute syndrome known as SARS in human was found to be caused by a coronavirus. So they called it SARS-1 or coronavirus 1, which was, they assumed it was derived from chicken in Hong Kong. So it went around and caused a serious epidemics in Hong Kong, and many people suffered and a few people died from it. But since it didn't get notoriety all over the world and it died off, people kind of ignored it and forgot about it. So now until 2019, when what looked like SARS attacked the Chinese people in Wuhan. So they thought it was a SARS like from Hong Kong, but when they made the analysis, they found that no, it wasn't SARS-1, it's another coronavirus variant that is not really SARS-1 that came from a chicken. So they called it coronavirus disease 19. 19 standing for 20,019. So now that started the whole scare, and the Chinese people, I don't know if they controlled it or not, they put their people in quarantine. The rest of the world ignored it. They thought it was gonna go away like SARS did in Hong Kong. And then the case of coronavirus 19 started showing up here and there, and mostly in adults and elderly. And many elderly started dying from that respiratory syndrome, which was noticed in SARS. Well, now the scare gets in, because now this virus is spreading to the Western world. The European countries start being attacked and elderly people dying, and now they sound an alarm and do all these other things. So COVID-19 takes on this amplitude, and we get into the Quack Marrow pandemic that we are in now, where the fact is this virus so far was not affecting younger people. It was not affecting children. So if it did affect the children the way chickenpox and others affect children, it wasn't going to be deadly. Probably it wasn't going to get the notoriety of the research that it got. But it got this notoriety because it was attacking the elderly without distinction between poor and rich, white or black. So now people wanted to protect themselves, and panic sets in, and sure, there's a pandemic. But like many other viruses of that type, coronavirus belongs to the same group of family as viruses like polio. It's not in the same category as HIV. No, it's in the same category as polio or hepatitis C or dengue and others. Those viruses have a genome that is RNA, but this RNA, without going into too many technical things, it acts like a messenger RNA of the cell, except it has all the information for the virus. So the point is, viruses that have RNA as a genome, whenever they replicate inside the cell, they go through a lot of mutations. Many mutants don't make it, but a few mutants survive. And then the system kind of selects for those that survive. So that's why you hear now we go into the variant 3, variant 4. Those are mutants that come up from those viruses that were replicating in people. But now the vaccine, since the virus is attacking the population that is more scared, now we're going to develop a vaccine. Well, to develop a vaccine that works very well, you need to know how to prevent this virus from attaching to the cells that it infects. So figure out on the surface of this virus what molecule is used to bind to cells to infect them, and make the vaccine based on that. In the old tradition, people would just grow the virus in the laboratory, purify it, and inactivate it. To inactivate it means you either boil it or you add it to formaldehyde or other chemicals to destroy its ability to reproduce, or you put it through radiation, and then you use that so that the human can make antibodies, and the human body will figure out what molecule this virus uses to latch onto cells. And if it makes enough of that antibody, the person is protected. That's how most of these virus vaccines that we've enjoyed so far, smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox, they were made that way. The polio virus, they're made that way, the vaccines. But this time, people wanted to be more sophisticated. Instead of putting this virus in there and make the body produce antibodies to things that are useless, let's figure out what molecule the body really needs. So they isolated the spike protein, which is the protein the virus uses to stick itself to cells. They found out the information that makes this spike protein, isolate it, and inject that information inside the cells so the cells can produce the spike protein, and the body will only make antibodies to the spike protein and nothing else. Yes, that's what they did. But since it's a new technology, you didn't run a whole lot of testing on it, and the people are in a panic. When they made the spike protein, the Pfizer made it and the Moderna made it, they add a few things to it so that the cells can take up this RNA once they inject it. And people made antibodies. Yes. Does it protect? Yes. It prevents the virus from attaching in the laboratory. Yes. So they give this vaccine an experimental go ahead to inject in a human, waiting to see if there's any other thing that can be done before they can launch it as a permanent vaccine. That's why people say, well, they developed this vaccine too fast. We don't know what is in it. It can do this, it can do that. Well, the point is, the vaccine is produced by Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, using the same technology. Johnson & Johnson is using a different technology. So now, all these vaccines, when they're used in the lab, the antibodies are produced, they protect. Now they give them the license to immunize individuals, adults. Well, adults are immunized. Now, most of the adults who have had immunization don't have any issue. But warning, any vaccine whatsoever, nothing is 100% safe. You will always find an outliers of people who either they didn't get vaccinated, the vaccine didn't work in them the way it should work, or they have another underlying problem that is aggravating their health situation. And now they say, okay, so-and-so got the vaccine and 20 people died. Well, in the world of virology and epidemiology, if I immunize 1 million people and 200 people die from that virus complications, it's no big deal, because that is what it would happen worse than that when people get the disease. So immunologists, virologists, they can say, okay, this is a kind of threshold, at least we protected that many people, but when an individual is affected, it's an individual, the family is affected, so you can't really downplay it as much. So it becomes political. Who's in charge of protecting the health of people in the society? Well, we live in the United States. We are a litigious country. If I get sick, you inject me with something, I'm going to sue you. So there's this branch of the government called the Center for Disease Control, which was created uniquely as to protect the public health. They're responsible for what measures has to be taken to protect the public when there's a threat for infectious disease or virus or whatnot and whatnot. So they make these recommendations. Well, other countries don't have entities like that. They just go about it. People die or they don't die. Nobody sues anybody because anybody got infected or whatnot. So we're in a totally different country. So now that the vaccine is there, people get vaccinated. Why are people afraid of it? A lot of wrong information circulating on the media. In the media, it's inundated by religious views, social views, nothing virology, nothing scientific. So the politicians have to protect their jobs. Politicians don't watch out for things that don't further their interest. So now we're in this quagmire, and if the virus has mutated, it started affecting and infecting youngsters. Well, it's a common cold virus. Well, they're not giving us the statistics of how many youngsters die from this virus like they were giving it for the adults. So for me, I think the virus is still acting like a regular coronavirus. It will infect the kids, but the kids are resilient. They will resist it. And just like we don't have a vaccine against chickenpox for kids, but the kids suffer a lot from chickenpox. The vaccine for chickenpox is made for adults because adults feel like they suffer greater pain than kids, but which is wrong. It's just because adults are wimps. They don't want to die, so they want to be protected. But why isn't there a vaccine against chickenpox for kids? Well, it's the same thing. Now there's this coronavirus. It's affecting kids, which it always did. They get the colds, they survive, but now the political thing is the adults who don't want to get the COVID and die are the ones who are more afraid. So now that's the whole thing. So now, who's adults who are at risk? Who's mostly at risk? People with underlying problems, health issues. Obesity is a problem. Obesity is a problem in many infections, because obesity will make the body overreact or underreact to protect itself. So in COVID-19 in adults, what kills is not the virus. What kills is the body immune system overreacting. It's producing a lot of these chemicals we call in immunology, the cytokines. The cytokines like interferons and other cytokines, interleukins, when the body produces a lot of them and dumps them in your system, they create havoc to the system. Where obesity can make people underregulate or overregulate. Processed food, especially sugar food. Well, if a diet is rich in sugar, that means the person has a lot of energy. So when they get infected, they have a tendency to produce a lot of these chemicals that are bad in the system anyway. Or there are other underlying conditions that we don't know much about. But when they report this and so had the COVID and they died, they don't tell you all the other clinical pictures that go with that person. Well, now, in our Black community, there's a lot of obesity, there's a lot of diabetes, there's a lot of hypertension, high blood pressure. These are conditions that can make the body overreact or underreact against the virus. So, should we tell people in the community not to be vaccinated? No, I advocate for vaccination. I have it. I got the Pfizer. My whole family is vaccinated, and I push for that. And if I happen to get the COVID now and this is true, and then I get clinical disease, so be it. But at least I did something to protect myself. Now with the Neil, you asked me about the booster. You mentioned something about the booster. I tell people, if I have to get the booster, I will get the booster. But before I do that, I will go to my physician and said, can you take a blood test and ask the lab to tell me what is my antibody level against the COVID spike protein? The reason I say that because something else. Okay, if you have worked in a hospital setting and they give you a vaccine against hepatitis B, they give you 2 shots. But after the 2 shots, they take your blood to see if you made enough antibodies or not. If you didn't, they'll give you another shot, because now you see where the litigious things come in, because they know not everybody who gets vaccinated makes the same amount of antibody. So if you didn't make enough antibody against hepatitis B and you're still working with the blood and you're in the hospital and you get to the hepatitis B, you can sue the hospital. So they want to make sure they immunize you enough to get enough antibody to be protected. Well, that's not done for all these vaccinations. You just vaccinate people and they go. You don't. Some people may not be protected because not everybody getting the same vaccine gets protected at the same level. But you need more people protected, even if it's low level, because that will stop the virus from having fertile grounds to multiply and go into the other vulnerable people. That's what they call the herd immunity. The more people are protected, then those who are not vaccinated being few and far between, the virus has no chance to really find them. It dies out. So I'll get the booster shot, but I have to ask my doctor to give me a test to tell me if I have enough antibodies or not. Then I'm going to ask, what is the acceptable antibody titer for COVID-19? If I don't have enough, I'll go for booster shot. If I have enough, there's no point to get the booster shot. So it's a scare. We're in the bad times. The wearing of the mask is back on, yes, because there are more kids getting infected. The temperature is changing. This is the time the kids go back to school. This is the time when kids start to school. Parents always know the kids come home with a cold. Well, is that called the COVID? Could it be flu? Could it be another rhinovirus or whatever else? So nowadays, anybody who has a cold, sniffles, runny nose, oh, you have a COVID. What happened to rhinovirus and others? They're still there. So it's a scare, but for precaution and caution and confidence in people, then they say, okay, wear your face mask so that we can protect those who have not been vaccinated yet. So my tendency is to go in places not wear a mask because I'm vaccinated, but being vaccinated doesn't mean I can't get infected. I can get infected, but I'm not going to get sick, but I can pass the virus to those who don't have the vaccination. So I will wear the mask for that. So that's the whole issue with this thing. But it's politicized because it depends on which spectrum you find yourself on. Are you on the conservative wing, or are you on the liberal wings, or are you whatever other group there are out there? So that's the best I can tell you. So unless you have a specific questions.
You know, Dr. Mbuie, I'm embarrassed to say that this thing has been around for 2 years, and this is the first time I've heard all of this stuff you're telling me. You know, like the average person, I probably was just relying on TV and the internet and things of that nature. I had all these questions prepared, but you were so comprehensive. I think you pretty much addressed them all. I do have one question though. You mentioned that it really did start in Hong Kong. And I remember when Donald Trump called it the China virus, I thought that was so offensive. I was like, did it really start in China or whatever? So that's interesting to know that it really did start in Hong Kong.
No. That's what started in Hong Kong in about 2005 or 2007 was the coronavirus cold infecting people in Hong Kong and causing a sudden respiratory problem that people didn't know what caused it.
Okay.
That's why they call it sudden acute respiratory syndrome. A syndrome is a disease that has many facets, but you have no idea really what is causing it. And then when they studied it, they found that it was a coronavirus that had evolved from a chicken or pigeon, and then they called it SARS-1, coronavirus 1. But the Hunan virus in 2019, the infection started in Hunan, and depending on which spectrum on the political wing you are in, Hunan has a very big biological research, just like we have NIH in America. So the Chinese run a lot of their biological research on viruses and everything else in Hunan, province of Hunan. So that's where people think that this virus is worked in the lab and somehow it escaped. The Chinese did not have good control on it and it escaped. Then if you keep following the political realm, you'll find that the Hunan lab works some projects with the United States NIH.
Mhm.
They also fund some of the research over there. So now, is this virus really a Chinese virus, or is it a virus that both of us, America and China, were working on for some reason and something got out of hand? You will never get the real story.
Thanks for clearing that up. Now,
Yes,
I guess my only other question is, I work in a school district.
yes,
And so we did scheduling for students back in April, March, and they had until June to say if they wanted to come back to the school this year or be virtual. So we have about 3,000 students, only about 100 will be in my school, I should say.
yes.
Only about 100 are going to be virtual. Now, parents are saying, hey, I think I want to change my mind and I want my child to be virtual, but it's too late to change. Do you think we're headed for another shutdown like we had in March of 2020?
We may, if the epidemic is attacking the youngsters in school to the point that you will not have enough students in school. If your school district gets attacked to a point that you have only 20% of students showing up, you're going to have to do something. You may end up going virtual. But to say that we're going to be going back to virtual for everybody, I'm not sure about that, because I don't know what the resources your school district has for quick change of things like that.
Right.
But that nobody can predict what will happen. It depends on how bad the winter is. And as I told you, if kids go to school and start coming down with the cold, unless they're specifically tested for COVID, all the colds that they suffer from may not be COVID, but we're going to lump them all together.
And that leads me to one other question, and I meant to ask it earlier, but you were going so well, I didn't even want to interrupt. You mentioned like kids coming home from school and saying, I have the virus, I have this cold or whatever. And people have always said that, oh man, I got sick. I think I had a virus and I was out for 3 days. Why is COVID so deadly compared to other viruses?
So deadly to who?
To the people it's killed that have died.
It's deadly to elderly. Any virus can be very deadly to elderly. You know how many elderly die every flu season from a flu virus? There are a lot of elderly who die from a flu during the flu season, but you never hear about it.
Why don't we? Why is this a global pandemic?
Because it's something we have accepted as normal. Elderly will succumb to flu virus more so than youngsters. So when that happens, because it happens during the flu season in America or whatnot, then we do that, okay, that's it. But if it's the same virus in China, in France, and that we're going to have a panic. But the flu, since the Spanish flu hasn't shown itself like that anymore.
Dre, you had something to add to that?
Another aspect of it to look at, the media gets a hold of things as well. And they start to find certain news cycles that help sell publications, help boost ratings. Think about it. Early on with the coronavirus, you didn't really hear much about it until there was a ship that came ashore outside of Seattle, and there was a lot of individuals that had tested positive, and they wanted to keep the ship at bay. Then all of a sudden, it became interesting to talk about, and then you had pockets where people were beginning to talk about the pockets that were being impacted a lot. So you had a lot of brown people who had these problems with diabetes, hypertension, obesity. Then it became the thing. You started noticing like CNN and other news stations were in these communities, because all of a sudden it was like, okay, here's the bleeding heart. Let's use this to put it out there and look at it from this aspect of it. So what I noticed myself being in the media, you saw a lot of people that were transitioning to, oh, this is why it's happening here. This is why it's happening there. And once the media gets a hold of something, it's kind of hard to put that fire out. Right. So there's still some smoke that's there. And I thought that some people did a good job of analyzing, hey, here's these communities that are impacted. I think it was New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Detroit that were like some of the biggest areas of pockets of Black people. And there was some research that I conducted, historical research, that pointed to the certain communities that you saw that were impacted and how long they had been impacted, how long that they had not had hospitals in their communities, did not have access to good foods, good education, and so forth. So there's a lot of correlations that compounded this situation to make it worse.
And
yes,
and that, I mean, that's interesting. That's all the media, the politics, everything. And unfortunately, most people, the average citizen, they listen to that and they won't have an opportunity to listen to a Dr. Mbuie really give, like the facts, the science, behind all of this. And Dr. Holmes, we talked about this earlier, about the fact that, and I don't know if it's laziness on our part, but we get our information in sound bites and media, and we're not really getting the science behind this. Dr. Mbuie was so comprehensive, I must admit, he answered all my questions, and I ran out. So Dr. Holmes, I hope you have some.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. It would appear that to deal with the virus, this particular virus, you need a multi-layered approach. So you mentioned the vaccines. You have several vaccines to choose from, and also mask wearing in those places like schools and whatnot. What other things can individuals do, and what's happening in terms of the research sector, in terms of developing therapies, therapies that go in addition to, in addition to the vaccines?
Okay, that's a good question. Let's say you, Dr. Holmes, and Dave, and I, and everybody else, we go through probably 80 viral infections a year that nobody knows anything about. We don't know anything about them. The only way you figure out, you find out the virus is if you get sick enough to go and seek for medical attention. And when they rule out everything else that they know that you don't have, then they will say, maybe you have a viral infection, and then they're going to start looking for virus in you. That's how viruses most of the time are discovered. because viruses are not something that you can just go take a swab somewhere and grow them in the lab. So we go through a lot of viral infections that we know nothing about. But what protects us against all these viral infections? What we call your state of health, whatever that means. Where your state of health includes your physical activity, your mental aptitude, your mental disposition. It includes your nutrition. It includes a whole lot of things. And for me, sometime when I was teaching, I will throw in there and students will laugh. I said, it includes your religious outlook. Do you go to church? Do you pray? Do you read your Bible? And then they'll laugh and say, what has that got to do with virus? I said, well, it may help your mental state somehow. So now going back to what I can, as I suggest people do is, there's something called the Phyto Chemicals, Phyto Chemicals. Well, when we eat a lot of food that is broken down, and there is a lot of things in the food we eat that are either detrimental to our health or that are beneficial to our health. So now you see all this push about being vegetarian, being vegan, cutting down on sugar, cutting down on this and that. They have something to do with it. So without any good proof for me, you know, our Dr. Holmes knows our common good friend, Dr. Gooden, Warren Gooden and I. We work on things that are unconventional. Well, plants that we eat, a lot of them contain chemicals that can stop virus from growing. Many different viruses. So in this context, I'll just say people should watch what they eat and increase your consumption of things like onions, garlic, and roots, green leaves, yellow leaves. Increase their consumption because they contain chemicals that can stop a lot of viruses. We start proving that in the lab. But when you try to prove it in the lab, it's not at the point or the stage of making it a drug yet. It's not at the point of making it a drug, but they are in there. So either you believe that or you don't. And me personally, I consume a lot of onion and garlic and collard greens and spinach and all these other things. Well, I like them, but if they help, that's fine. But there are chemicals in there that I can show you my research, even though it's not, most of it is not published. There are a lot of plants that stop virus from growing in the laboratory. So that's one aspect, nutrition, and these other things, physical aptitude, physical fitness, and all that. Yeah, they help. But since we are also afraid of COVID, just avoid being in crowds. Avoid the big crowds that you don't know too much about. And if that's not enough, well, I'm a believer that when this virus comes in, the first place it attacks is the nose, so you have to inhale it. So inhale it, it will lodge in the throat. So when I come in, I just have a really good salt solution that I gargle with 2-3 times a day, and that I believe that it can protect me. But can I sell that? No, I can't sell that. But if you go to Costco now, they're telling you you can buy alkaline water and everything. So people start thinking about those kind of things, but they're kind of a fringe. So we do what we can, and if we succumb, so what?
Dr. Mbuie, I have 2 more questions. Dr. Holmes,
Yeah.
did you have any more?
You go ahead. I have
Okay.
one more, but you go ahead.
I have 2 more questions. How
Yeah.
does tobacco and alcohol impact this? And I ask that because a lot of people like to go out and just, that's how they have a good time. So does tobacco and alcohol have any impact on COVID?
Excessive tobacco smoking is detrimental to the respiratory system, which that virus prefers to attack anyway. Alcohol to the excess is detrimental because it reduces the ability of the immune system to respond to the attacks from outside. Alcohol in moderation, people have pushed these different ideas, but nobody have really good proof. Red wine is protective against a lot of things. It has catechins, it has phenols, which are protective antivirals, but moderation. It can boost something in the immune system, it can suppress something, it depends on how the person reacts. And it's not something to say, okay, to avoid the viral infection, go and imbibe in drinking a lot of alcohol. That's irresponsible.
Right. Now, my last question, and I'll let Dr. Holmes close us out. My last question is this. As I mentioned before, you gave us so much great information, and like a fool, I just been listening to the news and things of that, seeing some on social media. Where would you tell people if they said, I want to know where I can go to get a lot of this information that you provided us? What's the best resource? Where would you send them?
I haven't seen really a compendium of a good research put together like that, because most of this research still lies in the head of the researchers. But if you, as you said, that when you see on the news, you don't see any virologist researcher being asked any question. They don't interview them. They interview MDs who are treating the disease, they interview the politicians and they don't interview the people who do the work. So that where can you find it? You just have to call people and talk to them, ask questions, yeah. But nobody has really taken time to write down a whole set of information because it's very disparate. It's not to put in one area because these people don't really communicate as much.
Yeah, so they can just watch this podcast. That's what they can do. They can watch this.
Yeah, tell them to watch this, and then if they have a question, they can call Dr. Holmes. He can get hold of Warren Gooden, and he can get hold of me. Then I can get hold of somebody else, and yes.
Hey, we appreciate that. Well, Dr. Holmes, why don't you go ahead and ask your last couple of questions?
Yeah, I had one last question. It's been suggested that viruses like this can come in, be kind of deadly, and then mutate over time where they just become another kind of cold or something of that.
Let me correct that.
Okay.
Viruses like the coronavirus grows inside the cells with a cycle of no more than 48 hours. In 24 hours, it's produced and that cell is dead. New crops of viruses have come up. So if you put one virus particle inside the cell and everything goes well, that's when that cell dies, it probably produces 100,000 virus particles. Out of the 100,000 virus particles, probably 10% of them are mutants of a sort. They're not all the same mutants. Then when these 10% infect new cells, some of them are not successful because they're so damaged, and some of them are so adapted to grow well. That's where we get these variants coming from. They don't have to wait to grow in the people for 2-3 years. No, they mutate in one generation. That's it. So in your body, when you get infected with the virus, before you know you are infected, the virus has been replicating in your body for about 7 days. So by the 7th day, you start seeing the symptom. That's why they say, if you've been exposed, quarantine yourself for 14 days, because the 14 days will do like, okay, in 7 days, if we don't see the symptom of fever and everything else, we may miss it, just take another 7 days just to be sure you didn't get sick. So most of the time when people realize they have the disease, they have produced a lot of virus already. And that's when the body is either overdoing the fighting or it gave up and the virus takes over.
Well, Dr. Mbuie, we want to thank you for joining us today. I think this is the most comprehensive information on COVID that I've seen, and I'm proud to say it's going to be on our podcast. So we really want to thank you for that. And if we go into another lockdown, we'll have to have you back so you can tell everybody what they need to do.
Then if we come back on lockdown, I'm glad. I hope I'm still here.
Hey, we hope you're still here too.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no